Welcome to our Activate Your Impact Nonprofit Policy Summit. I'm Kira Kazantzis, and I am here with my colleagues and our special keynote speaker to talk to you about policy and in the middle of a global pandemic. Why are we talking about policy in the middle of a global pandemic? I know nonprofit organizations already do so much in our community, especially in times of great need like now. And it's also important that every nonprofit use its voice and lift up community voices to bring lasting positive change for the community we serve. At SVCN, we believe that advocacy is a sacred duty of nonprofits, and it should be a core competency. So SVCN is here to help you advance your mission, secure needed resources, and work with you to build an equitable and thriving community. By the way, I know we're here at lunch, and I just wanted to prove that I indeed am here with lunch with you. I hope you all have your lunch and you're kind of settling in to hear this amazing talk. We want to say a couple logistical things before we kick off. We're really incredibly grateful to our sponsors for sticking with us as we pivoted from our in-person summit to a 5-webinar series. They are Palo Alto Medical Foundation Sutter Health, Applied Materials Foundation, El Camino Health, the Health Trust, Housing Authority Santa Clara County, Santa Clara Family Health Plan, SV at Home, and Valley Medical Center Foundation. Thanks to you all. Of course, we all wish we were here in person so we could interact with each other, but we're going to do our best to answer your questions during this session, and we're going to capture your ideas as well. My colleague Jen Tarai, who's our Director of Learning and Member Engagement, is going to explain the logistics of the webinar, and she will be followed by our Chief Strategy and Policy Officer, Wendy Ho, who will introduce our amazing keynote speaker. Jen.
Thank you, Kira. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Kira said, we are going to try to answer as many questions as possible. And the way that we will do that is with the Q&A function. So if you all look down toward the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon. You can click on that and enter any questions that you have for our speaker today. The answers will be threaded along with the questions, and I really like that feature. So hopefully it's helpful to all of you as well. Keep in mind that the chat function has been disabled, so you will not be able to use the chat function to communicate with anyone during this webinar. And then another really key piece of logistical information that I want you all to know is that after you exit this webinar today, there will be a link that you will immediately be taken to. It's a SurveyMonkey link. That is our evaluation for our event today. I would really appreciate it if you go ahead and fill that out before you leave the session completely. It will be really helpful for us to get your feedback, not only for today's session, but for future sessions that we can help to provide for our members. And then I will also send a follow-up email after this session, and you will get whatever information that Dale and our team would like to share. So keep an eye out for that as well. As far as logistics go, I think that's all of them for today. So I will go ahead and pass it over to Wendy.
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I am Wendy Ho, the Chief Strategy and Policy Officer of the Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits, and it is my very distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who actually shares my last name, but I assure you we are not related. Dale Ho is the director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project and supervises the ACLU's Voting Rights Litigation Division. He successfully argued against the Census citizenship question before the US Supreme Court, and he has testified on election law before Congress and in various state legislatures across the country. He also serves as an adjunct clinical professor at the NYU School of Law. Dale is a frequent commentator on voting rights issues, appearing on television programs including CNN, The Rachel Maddow Show, and All In with Chris Hayes. Not only is Dale a legal rock star, but he is also a budding YouTube star. You may have noticed his cameo in a video on voter suppression with comedian Louis Black that we sent out yesterday in preparation for today's session. Dale is a proud graduate of the Yale Law School, Princeton University, and our very own Bellarmine College Prep. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dale Ho. Dale, take it away.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And thank you all for participating in this now webinar instead of in-person summit, and for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. As a Bay Area native, I grew up in San Jose. I went to Bellarmine. I was really hoping to do this in person and really looking forward to it. But I'm still grateful to have the chance to chat with you all today about voting rights issues and the census. So as Wendy said, I am the director of the Voting Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. I've worked there for about the last 7 years. You know, the ACLU, I'm sure many of you are familiar with us, but for those who aren't, we're the nation's oldest civil rights, civil liberties legal organization. Just this year, we're celebrating our 100th year, and the ACLU has been there in, you know, a lot of the big civil rights and social justice fights that this country has seen in courtrooms over the last century. Everything from the Korematsu case, where we represented Fred Korematsu and others challenging the Japanese internment, through Loving versus Virginia in the 1960s, establishing a right to marry people regardless of race, through the present, and cases like Obergefell, where we challenged bans on same-sex marriage in the Supreme Court, and a case that I argued last year that Wendy mentioned, challenging the Trump administration's attempt to put a citizenship question on the census. I direct our voting rights work, which means I oversee our litigation around the country. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the census case, and how COVID is affecting not just the census, but voting rights generally as we head up towards the November general election. I'm going to try to keep it short. That's kind of hard for lawyers sometimes, but I'm going to try to talk for fewer than 30 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of a question and answer afterwards. I thought I'd start with a video, not the one that Wendy mentioned, but a different one that we produced a few weeks before I argued the census case in the Supreme Court. So I'm a little new. We've all been doing Zoom now, I think, more than we would have liked to be over the last 2 months. But I'm still a little new with the share your screen function. I'm gonna do my best here to try to get it done. So I hope folks can see that. But this is just a little explainer about the citizenship question, census litigation that was in the Supreme Court last year that we put together, just kind of giving an overview of the issues.
Oh, so much junk mail.
You know, I wouldn't throw that out. That's pretty important.
Oh my God. How did you get in here?
The census is a once-in-a-decade opportunity that affects everything in our lives.
I'm sorry, do you live in this building?
The whole point of the census is that every person gets counted, adults and children, citizens and non-citizens. It's literally in the Constitution.
Is that the real Constitution?
No.
Okay. It says John Adams on there.
For every person that gets counted in the census, that decides how many representatives we get and where dollars get spent on things like social services, healthcare, and roads.
So why is that a bad thing?
Oh, that's the good news. The bad news is that the Trump administration wants to add the question, are you a citizen, to the census?
So what's wrong with asking people if they're citizens?
Well, the administration itself estimates that putting that question on will cause 6.5 million people not to respond to the census. Just to put that in perspective, if you put all those people together, they would be our 16th largest state, more people than the population of Tennessee.
Arizona, Tennessee.
It would be like if all of those people went poof.
Okay, that was very spooky. But wait, why don't they just answer the question?
Well, they should. Census responses are by law supposed to be confidential, but can you really blame people, especially immigrants and people with immigrants and their families, if they don't really feel like sharing that information with this administration?
I guess not. I mean, I don't even like checking on Facebook anymore. But look, let's say these people are cut out. They're just numbers. I mean, how does that really affect people's lives?
Well, census data are used to decide how many seats that each state gets in Congress. And if this question stays on there, then states like California and Texas and Florida, New York, Illinois, Arizona are all likely to lose a seat in Congress and a vote in the Electoral College.
Okay, I know that's bad.
Oh, it gets worse. Census data are used to allocate $900 billion in federal funds annually for things like schools and healthcare and roads.
I am constantly driving on roads.
And local governments use census data to plan for things like natural disasters, earthquakes and hurricanes.
A meteor hitting the Earth.
Yeah.
Yes, because if that happens, we're done. Have you seen Armageddon?
Yeah. The most important thing to think about are your neighbors, your friends, your family members. The citizenship question isn't about just a line on a form. It's about whether or not everyone in America counts. If this question is allowed to go forward,
Then immigrants all over the country are going to be freaking out when someone from the government knocks on their door to ask a question about citizenship.
that's right. And the ripple effects could be enormous. Our communities
We'll lose political representation.
Exactly, and that's exactly what the Trump administration wants. They added this question knowing it went against the advice of the last 5 census directors and knowing that it would harm communities all across America.
And make us less safe when a meteor hits the Earth.
Sure.
Wait, how do you know all this?
Because we're arguing this case in the Supreme Court this month.
Wait, who are you?
I'm Dale Ho. I'm the director of the ACLU Voting Rights Project. Oh, this is my stop. Have a good day.
Yeah. Good luck, Dale. Have you heard about the census? Yeah, it's crazy shit.
So we use that to try to just give an overview of the census. Sometimes, when you try to explain this issue, because it's sort of so foundational to the issues that affect everyday lives, but doesn't in a really visible way affect people's kind of everyday life, it's a little bit challenging to explain in the span of a few minutes. But what I always try to say is that the census is about money and power. It's about access to federal resources, federal programs that rely on census counts, and it's about power. It's about representation in Congress, because the number of people who get counted in a state determine how many seats in Congress a state gets, how many votes in the Electoral College that state gets, and individual communities, it depends. The census count determines how much representation individual communities get in their state legislatures. So I'm going to share my screen again with a PowerPoint about this, if I can find it. My apologies. Oops. That's not it. I had it a moment ago. Thank you all for bearing with me as I try to navigate our new reality. I think I got it. All right. So the census, right? It determines the allocation of money and power in this country, and it's critically important to get an accurate count. If people don't respond to the census, they're not counted, and their communities and states receive less money and power. Unlike other kinds of government surveys, there's no attempt to try to adjust statistically for an undercount. If people don't respond to the census and they don't respond to census workers who try to follow up with them, they're just not counted at all, and that's a direct loss to their communities. So right now, the census response rate is at 59.7%. We're almost at 60% of households responding to the 2020 census. COVID is obviously complicating things, and I'll return to that in a minute, but I just have a question. If I could do a quick poll, I think we can do this. And that is, how many of you who are here with us today have completed the census so far? Really good. not everyone's responded yet, but way over 90% so far, much better than the national rate, which is around 60. But that's great. Now, as you all know, the administration tried to add a citizenship question to the census. It would have been the first time that there would have been such a question on the census in 70 years. In December of 2017, the Department of Justice sent a letter to the Census Bureau asking to add this question to the census, and they said they needed it to enforce the Voting Rights Act, so to protect voting rights. And you know, as someone who works in voting rights, I have to say I found that kind of remarkable, because the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and during that entire time, we never had a citizenship question on the census. We were able to protect voting rights and enforce the Federal Voting Rights Act without a citizenship question. And then 3 months later, the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, who oversees the census, testified in Congress that he began thinking about adding a citizenship question to the census after he got the Department of Justice's letter, and that he did it only because the Department of Justice had sent that letter and asked for a citizenship question. And we knew that this couldn't possibly be true. So we looked at this question that they wanted to add to the census, which is, if you look at it here, and you can see it on your screens, it's kind of bizarre in terms of the way it breaks out different kinds of citizens, right? People born in the continental states versus people born in territories versus people born abroad versus people who are naturalized. It seems a little intrusive in terms of the way that it breaks down that information. And we knew they couldn't possibly need it to add a question, to enforce the Voting Rights Act. And we were also knew that it would be a really, really big problem. It was expected to dramatically reduce participation in the census, and the past 5 directors of the Census Bureau came out against it. And I just have another question and a poll that I'd like to ask everyone. How many of your organizations do education or outreach around the census? Bring that poll up. So as that poll is I'm filling in, it looks like, you know, about half, a little more, maybe closer to 60% of you work at organizations that do census education or outreach. So you're, I'm sure, pretty familiar with why this is particularly challenging. I think those results have been shared. It's a sensitive question. It's the kind of question that turns people off and makes people want to close their doors and not talk to people from the government. The Trump administration, particularly this administration, right, which has been picking people up at sensitive places that, you know, in past administrations were considered off limits for immigration enforcement, courthouses, schools, hospitals, and the like. The administration conducted its own study while all of this was going on, and they estimated that about 5% of households that include a non-citizen, or almost 7 million people, would not respond to the census if you put this question on there. And we knew that that would have a different effect around the country, because obviously households with non-citizens, they're clustered in particular states and communities. We looked at the data and had some political scientists analyze it, and their conclusion was that 6 states, including California, would likely lose a seat in Congress and a vote in the Electoral College for president, and obviously billions of federal dollars. So we felt like we had no choice. We had to sue. And we took this case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Those were a couple of pictures from the steps after we had the argument that day. That was my first time arguing in the Supreme Court, and I will tell you, with this court being the way that it's constituted, I'm not eager to go back up there again. Well, in the course of litigating this case, we learned that the real motive for adding the citizenship question was not to protect voting rights. It was not to protect communities of color. It was, in fact, the opposite. It was to undercount immigrant communities, and in particular Latinx communities, and drain them of resources and representation. That may seem obvious to everyone, but we actually found the receipts to show that this was the case. So I mentioned, I think, that the Department of Justice sent a letter to the Census Bureau in December of 2017 saying that they would like a question about citizenship on the census. And the Commerce Secretary, who made the decision ultimately to add it, he said that the reason he did it was because of the Department of Justice's letter, and that's what started his decision-making process. All of that was false. The Commerce Secretary lied to Congress when he so testified. In the course of litigating our case, we found emails of the Commerce Secretary dating back to February of 2017. So, you know, almost 10 months before the Department of Justice ever asked about a citizenship question, he was getting angry emails from his staff about the fact that non-citizens are counted in the census. They thought non-citizens shouldn't be counted at all. By May of 2017, so 7 months before the Department of Justice ever sent its letter, he wrote angry emails to his staff demanding to know why the census had not already been changed, and in accordance with his instructions to stop the counting of non-citizens. In July of that year, again, months before the Department of Justice letter, there was email correspondence between Secretary Ross and a man named Chris Kobach, who was considered a front runner for Department of Homeland Security Secretary. He was at the time the chief election official in Kansas and had been advising the Trump campaign on immigration issues. And in their email exchanges, Mr. Kobach had proposed the citizenship question to prevent what he called the problem of counting illegal aliens in the census. In the fall of that year, the Department of Justice declined to ask for a citizenship question on the census. They said they didn't need it. And then Wilbur Ross reached out directly to then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who directed his staff at the Department of Justice after that conversation to give Commerce, quote, whatever they need. And it was only after all of that happened that the Department of Justice sent a letter to the Commerce Department and the Census Bureau asking for a citizenship question and claiming that they needed it to enforce the Voting Rights Act. It was only thanks to the litigation over this that we were able to unearth all of those documents and learn the true timeline. We won the case at trial, and then we went directly to the Supreme Court, and in a ruling that I think surprised a lot of people, we won 5-4, a decision authored by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who is not something, you know, is not a liberal, not a progressive, is a very conservative jurist, rejecting the Trump administration's story, essentially saying that the Trump administration had lied about why they wanted a citizenship question, and because they had lied, it was illegal, and there will be no citizenship question on the 2020 census, thankfully. But the aftermath, although we don't have a citizenship question on the census, as I'm sure many of you know, knew before we started talking today, there's still a lot of fears about an undercount. Historically, the census has undercounted communities of color and immigrant communities. And even though the citizenship question isn't there, there's a lot of residual fear about it, and some concern that the damage may have already been done in terms of scaring off immigrants and people who have immigrants in their families from answering the census. And now COVID has complicated things substantially. The census was supposed to have been in the field for the last 7 weeks. following up with households who hadn't returned their surveys, but they haven't been able to do that. As of April 1st, so this is some older data, only 36% of households had responded to the census. I think I mentioned that we're up to 60% now. That's better. But just to compare things to 2010, 10 years ago, during the last census, April 1st of 2010, 50% of households had already responded to the census by April 1st. So we start in a big hole thanks to the pandemic. And I think what that really tells you is that the work of doing census education and outreach, telling people how important it is for them to respond to the census, and really the work that many of you are doing to educate people about that, it's more critical right now than maybe it's ever been in any previous census. So I'm really grateful to the work that many of you are doing about census outreach. Now, the census isn't the only thing that's been disrupted by the pandemic. Our lives are, obviously. We would be in person if not for the pandemic. But with respect to the work that I do, preparing for the 2020 election has already become very challenging, and there have already been a lot of disruptions. This was a famous picture taken during the Wisconsin primary last month. The pandemic has already disrupted the 2020 election cycle. A lot of locations that are typically used for polling places, like schools, are closed. Like senior centers are no longer open for voting because they're home to particularly vulnerable people. A lot of people who would ordinarily be signing up to be poll workers are not doing it. If you looked at the 2016 election, more than half of poll workers were over the age of 60, so exactly the age group that is most vulnerable to severe complications from COVID. So we're seeing a lot of polling place closures and staffing shortages. And then of course, voters themselves are either unable to or are very reluctant to venture from their homes and vote in person. So the way that most people have voted in this country historically is in person at a polling place on election day, and that is going to be really challenging in November. Milwaukee, in the primary last month, went from 180 to just 5 polling places. 175 out of 180 polling locations closed. In a lot of places, like the place in this picture, there were many hour waits for people to vote. So I want to do another poll. I just want to get a sense for the kind of work, the broad range of civic engagement work that folks do. How many of your organizations do voter registration or voter engagement and education, or even get out the vote work on election day, or none of the above? While that poll is filling up, I'll start talking about, how we're responding to the situation. There are a lot of things that we need in order to prepare for November. The number one priority for us, and it's not by itself, it's not enough, but the number one priority for us has been to facilitate voting by mail. And now I'm looking at this, and it looks like about 2/3 of you are at organizations that do some kind of civic engagement work around the election, whether it's voter registration, about 1/3 of you, education and engagement, about 1/2 of you, and then actual GOTV work, about 1/4 of you, which is really interesting. So that it's going to be really challenging. The work that you would ordinarily be doing right now, whether it's registering voters through voter registration drives or preparing to do GOTV work and help people get to the polls, like all of that has been disrupted right now. The number one thing that we're focusing on is trying to facilitate voting by mail. It's the safest way to vote right now, but a lot of states have unnecessary barriers. Many states, 16 in all, do not let every eligible voter vote by mail. You have to have one of a particular list of excuses. Other states have unnecessary barriers, like they actually require you to I'm just going to share these results so people can see what they look like. They actually require you to get a witness or more than one witness to sign your absentee ballots to verify that you are who you say you are. A handful of states even require you to get a notary to do it, which is, really challenging during the pandemic. So we're going to do what we can to make sure that everyone is eligible to vote by mail and that people don't have to navigate unnecessary barriers like these witness signatures or notarization requirements that require you to break the public health social distancing protocols that we're all trying to follow right now to keep ourselves and our communities safe. I do want to just clarify, though, briefly before talking a little bit about voting by mail, that voting by mail by itself is not enough, right? There are going to be people who can't take advantage of voting by mail. People with certain vision impairments, for example, frequently cannot use absentee paper ballots. Voters who are limited English proficient usually do not get ballots in their preferred languages. Low-income and young voters tend to move more frequently and the state may not have accurate, current, up-to-date address information for them to send them a ballot. And so they're going to need to vote in person. And then California, like a lot of states, permits people to register in person on election day. And people who take advantage of that to either register for the first time or update their registrations, it's going to be too late for them to vote by mail, and they're going to need an opportunity to vote in person. So I just want to be really clear that although we're trying to do everything we can to facilitate voting by mail, we're not saying that states and counties should get rid of in-person voting. They need to maintain those opportunities, particularly for vulnerable populations that need them, and they've just got to make sure that they're operated safely and that they have the equipment to do that. But we should be doing everything we can to reduce the density of people showing up at the polls on election day, because obviously congregating in large crowds isn't a great thing right now. So we want to get as many people voting by mail as we can, and people voting early in person, so that takes some of the pressure off of election day. So what are we doing, though, to facilitate voting by mail? We have brought 8 lawsuits just in the past 6 weeks to expand access to voting by mail. We've sued Texas, Missouri, South Carolina, and Tennessee because those states did not permit every eligible voter to cast their ballots through the mail. And I'm happy to report that Missouri and South Carolina have already backed off of that. Missouri's passed a law that'll allow every voter to vote by mail. South Carolina has done that for the primary, and we're hopeful that they're going to do that again for the general. And that's, I think, in response to the laws that we brought, because before we sued, they had said that they weren't going to do that. We're also suing to remove unnecessary obstacles. I think I mentioned those witness signature requirements. Virginia, South Carolina, those are states where you need another person to sign your ballot when you vote by mail. Tennessee is a state where you have to get a notary. Missouri is a state where you have to get a notary when you vote by mail. And I'm happy to report that in response to our lawsuit, Virginia has already agreed not to require witness signatures for their primary. Hopeful that they'll do it again for the general election. And then we've brought a case about the right to have someone assist you with your absentee ballot. A lot of people have trouble voting by mail because they can't get the same kind of assistance that you get when you vote in person at a polling place. There aren't poll workers to help you when you're filling out your ballot by yourself. And if you just make a technical mistake or you don't understand the instructions, you can get your ballot tossed for failure to follow all of the instructions to the T. It is true, as you tell people about voting by mail, it is true that ballots that are cast by mail tend to get rejected more frequently than ballots that are cast in person. And we don't know exactly why that's the case, but we think it's because people don't have assistance, someone to answer their questions when they're filling out their ballots. Some states prohibit giving that kind of assistance. They make it illegal for someone, for example, to help someone explain the absentee ballot instructions and then maybe take their ballot to a drop-off location for the voter or to the post office for the voter. And Montana is one of those states. And so we sued Montana over that, particularly because people who live on Native American reservations don't have access to the postal service at their doorstep. They typically need, if they want to cast votes by mail, they typically need someone to help them convey their ballots, either to an election office or the post office. And Montana was prohibiting that, making it very hard for people to vote on American Indian reservations. So we sued, and just yesterday, our court in that case gave us a temporary ruling in our favor. We're going to get a hearing next week to see if that temporary ruling will be extended throughout the election season. And that's just the beginning. We have more lawsuits planned to try to make sure that voting by mail is easier for people around the country. Fortunately, you're all in California, where, relatively speaking, it's easier than in a lot of states. It's not as easy as, say, in Washington or Oregon or Colorado. Those are states where every registered voter gets their ballot in the mail. But there's been a big push in California, I know, to get everyone a ballot application or a ballot itself, which would be something done for the first time here in California. So that would be great. And voters are going to need to know about that, because even as we work to improve access to voting by mail, the challenge is that a lot of voters don't know how to do it. I think I mentioned before that 34 states already allow all eligible voters to vote by mail. And even if the laws don't change at all in those states, you're going to see record demand for mail-in ballots. Just to give you an example, Wisconsin, which we were talking about earlier, they went from 250,000 absentee ballot requests in their 2016 primary to almost 1.3 million in their primary this year. So the number of people who wanted to vote by mail in Wisconsin in its primary this year, because of the pandemic, quintupled. And we're likely to see that all around the country. One last poll. I just want to know, how many of you have voted by mail before? I think it's interesting to see, because, you know, I think most people have an experience of, you know, mostly voting in person. This is interesting. Most of you have, which is great. Wow, so over 90% of you have voted by mail before. I think that's maybe partly a function of how easy California makes it relative to other states. But the bottom line is that most people still don't have an experience of voting by mail. And I think what that underscores is how important it was going to be to educate voters about mail-in voting. It would be easier if we had one system in this country for voting by mail. Unfortunately, we have 50 different systems. Every state has different rules for who can vote by mail, whether you need to actually ask for a ballot to be sent to you, or if it'll be sent to you automatically. And if you do have to ask for it, how you do that and by when you need to do it, whether you need someone else to certify your ballot with a signature, and the deadline by which you need to return it. All of these rules differ from state to state. So what we've done to try to make things easier for organizations that do voter education work, we've created a site called Keep Calm and Carry On Voting. It serves as a resource for organizations that want to educate voters about how to vote by mail, and has all of that critical information that I mentioned. So far, we've only done information for the remaining primaries, but by the middle of the summer, we'll have all those rules for every state individually. And our state ACLUs will have that information for their individual states prominently displayed on their websites. So we hope we can be a useful resource. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the work of nonprofits that do voter education and civic engagement work like many of you do. It's going to be more critical than ever, because more people than ever are going to need to navigate a voting system that they're totally unfamiliar with. And it's going to be up to folks like you to help people navigate that system. So I just, thank you so much for all the work that you do, not just on voting, but the whole range of issues that all of you work on. So that's just kind of an overview of what I've been working on, from the census to voting, and how we've been trying to respond to the COVID crisis. But I'm happy now to talk to you all about our work or other issues that you're encountering, whether it's related to the census or voting or civic engagement more generally, and to have a conversation with our remaining time.
Thanks so much, Dale, for your insights. Certainly the work continues, and as you mentioned, we all have a critical role to play in making sure that we've got not only an accurate census count, but ensuring people have and use that right to vote. Again, folks, if you have a question for Dale, I encourage you to pop it into the Q&A box. And we have one that we would like to answer live, and this comes from Mitch. Obviously, we live in the Bay Area, where the housing crisis is a constant concern. How does the census relate to funding for affordable housing?
That's a great question. And I wish I had a good answer for it off the top of my head. I know that dozens of federal programs have their funding allocated based on total census headcount. I'm not sure about HUD funding. The one that I'm most familiar with is the amount of Medicaid reimbursements that states get. So it's absolutely critical for, I know, healthcare, and that's a big issue right now with a lot of people losing their health insurance during the pandemic. I'm not totally sure about how the census counts affect HUD distributions, but it would not surprise me if they did.
Right. We know that we rely on census data to inform a lot of the allocations that the federal agencies make to both state and local governments. So even more reason to get out and get out the count. And I just looked at Santa Clara County's response rates. We're about 70% that have responded to the census. So we're doing better than folks nationally. And so I really want to lift up the work that we've been doing collectively to ensure that we do have an accurate census count here in Santa Clara County. And I'm checking to see if we have any other questions that have come in. And I'm not seeing any. I think you wowed our audience, Dale. So thank you for that. Jen, do you want to take over the mic and close us out? Well, I spoke too soon.
We just had a couple of questions
come in. That's okay. We have a question from Crystal, who asks, how is the census used to determine the need for more or less first responder hiring? And we'll go ahead and answer that live.
Yeah, I know that state and local governments use census data for a lot of municipal planning, right? It probably varies from place to place as to, precisely how they rely on the census to make those kinds of determinations. So I'm not sure about first responder funding precisely where you all are. I'm sure at the municipal level, those decisions are made.
Right. So again, we use that census data to inform local decision making, and as we know, local government budgets are definitely a statement of our values. So if we don't have that accurate census count, we don't know, where the needs are. We can't do the analysis to determine where we might need to invest some additional resources. So next question comes from Anne. With changes to the census timeline, what do you see as some of the primary challenges for California as we look to redistricting?
This is going to be a significant problem. Thank you for that question, Anne. The Census Bureau has already announced that they're going to be delayed in their delivery of not just the total population counts, but the granular population counts block by block and the demographic data that accompanies it, which are relied on when redrawing districts, congressional districts, state districts, county commission districts, everything. And it's going to come late. And it's not just going to come late, but we're, I think, particularly worried about greater undercount, particularly in communities of color and those communities that are particularly hard hit by the pandemic. Now, I think the first thing that I'm concerned about is, the reason why we use this, well, let me just back up for a second. The reason why the census data is used for that is every 10 years, population shifts a lot within a state or within a county. Population grows in one place relative to other places, maybe it even shrinks in other places. And every 10 years, we have to take that data and redraw the districts so that every district has roughly the same number of people. That's why redistricting is tied to the census and why it affects the allocation of political power so much. My concern is that population growth in California and around the country really has really been driven by the growth of communities of color, right? And those are the populations that historically get undercounted by the census, and the populations that are the communities that are getting hardest hit by COVID. And my worry is that because of all of this, the census is not going to capture that increase in population in diverse communities as well, and that those communities are going to lose out on their fair share of funding and representation. The late delivery of all the data is going to complicate everything enormously, because typically you get the data in the spring of 2021, and that gives you about a year to redraw the districts, make sure that they're accurately representing communities, make sure that everyone's kind of getting their fair share of representation. Because you need to get those districts set in time for the primaries in 2022, which is about a year later. Now that the deadline is getting pushed back for the expected publication of all of that data, we're going to have even less time. And 1 year is already, candidly, not as much time as I think we would like to have for that. Now, if California is going to have to redraw all of its congressional, state assembly, state senate districts, and then every county within California have to read those who are using districts rather than electing at large are going to have to redraw their districts individually. And that is just like a ton of work to accomplish in 9 months, not just to do the initial drafts, but to make sure that those maps are fair. And I'm really nervous that we're not going to have, it's possible that we're not going to have new maps in place in time for the 2022 elections.
These are certainly unprecedented times, and who knew that being sheltered in place would have so many ripple effects. So many of the organizations, Dale, folks who are on today's webinar are involved with census outreach and voter education, as noted by the polls. But I think in California, we have some very unique populations that are very hard to reach. Are there lessons that you have learned from other communities in your work nationally about kind of best tried and true outreach tactics, particularly given the shelter in place context that we find ourselves in at the current time?
I mean, that's a terrific question, and I wish I had a great, a brilliant answer for you, because, we don't do that kind of community outreach ourselves at the ACLU. So I don't have a lot of expertise in it sort of generally in normal circumstances. And now we're obviously in a totally unprecedented situation where you're trying to do a door-to-door, household by household count when you're not supposed to leave the house, right? It's a really challenging thing. Now, the good news for 2020, as opposed to every other census we've had in the past, is that this is the first year that you can fill the census out online, right? And I know that there are obviously always, internet access and digital divide concerns that we need to be mindful about, but, you can actually fill out the census on a smartphone today. And my hope is that digital outreach can be made easier when you're trying to facilitate participation in something that can be done digitally, right?
So to that point, here in Santa Clara County, I know we've done a tremendous job in shifting some of our traditional tried and true grassroots outreach to try to get that census count out. So I know many of our organizations, including some of whom are on the call this afternoon, are looking at virtual phone banks and calling nonprofit clients to encouraging them and assisting them with completing their census. I know we're also involved in efforts to do mass texting campaigns to also encourage communities to fill out the census. And I think those efforts have really shown some great progress in the fact that we've got 70% of Santa Clara County residents who have already responded to the census. But we still have 30%, and that 30% may be those folks that are in those hard to count communities that are left out of that because they have the digital divide concerns. Just to change the flavor up, I think we've got a request to hear any good anecdotes you may have from trials you argued in front of either Supreme Court or different courts throughout your career. I think that would be fun to hear. Any notable moments?
Well, this was, so this was my first time arguing a case in the Supreme Court. I had been involved in 3 cases representing parties in the Supreme Court before. And it was sort of like every time I was involved in a case in the Supreme Court, I got a little bit closer to the justices. Like the first time when I was a baby lawyer, just kind of, writing some briefs, but not, one of the main decision makers in a case. I was way in the back, right, with the public. I had to get there, at 5 a.m. like everyone else, to make sure that I got into the courtroom that day. Second time I had a case in the Supreme Court, I was at the table, but not talking, right? So I got to, carry a briefcase, right? And one thing that's really weird about the Supreme Court, I will say, aside from like the formality of it and like how kind of cavernous the space is how close you are to the justices. When you're sitting at the table or you're at the lectern, you're about 10 feet away from the justices of the Supreme Court. That's closer than like I think I've been to like any other judges when I've been in a courtroom. Normally, when I'm in a courtroom, I'm at a podium that's maybe 20 feet or more away from the judges whom I'm addressing. But then to get up to the podium and just be about 10 feet away from all 9 of them, you're told when you're preparing for the argument that you're not going to get many words in before they start peppering you with questions. And I went through a series of practice arguments before that with people who've argued dozens of cases in the Supreme Court. And, I was able to get out like 5 words in every one of those practices before the questions started coming fast and furious. I got up there during the argument, and there's a clock there to show you exactly how much time you have, and how much time has elapsed. And I start talking, and I'm talking, and I'm talking. And before I know it, I'm 45 seconds into like my spiel, and no one has asked me a question. And this little voice in me just said to me, like, this is really weird, right? Like, I'm talking, I'm still talking, I'm looking all 9 Supreme Court justices in the eye, and I'm still talking. And I had to sort of like tell myself, shut up, right? Like just get back in the zone and like make the arguments that you need to make. And then as soon as like I had that kind of surreal out of body experience, the questions started coming, and then I had to, do my tap dance for the remainder of my time. It was a really kind of crazy experience. I'm proud of the work that we did, but I think every kind of like kid when you're in law school and like you want to go into this kind of work. My dream was to be a civil rights lawyer. Like, the dream was to argue a big case in the Supreme Court. I will tell you, I am not eager to do that again. It was, probably the hardest that I'd ever worked over a, 4 or 5 month period. And it's, a difficult place. If you care about social justice, it's a very difficult place to win a case right now. And I'm like I said, I'm proud of what we did. I feel in a lot of ways kind of lucky that we got the result that we got, and I'm not eager to repeat it.
But hey, you can check those things off of your bucket list, right, Dale?
Yeah,
So there's that.
Been there.
Well, thank you, Dale, for humoring us with that fun anecdote. I want to turn it back over to my colleague, Jen, to close our first session of AYA out.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you, Dale, for just a really great discussion or presentation, actually. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, your experience, and everything that you're working on, because we believe that the work that you're doing is very important in supporting the work that we're doing out here in Santa Clara County. So thank you. I want to thank everyone for participating. I know that virtual summits are a new thing, so thanks for joining us today. I do want to let you all, or I also want to thank our sponsors again, and here are the lovely logos that we have. But I also want to remind everybody that this is the kickoffs of a series of webinars that are part of our Activate Your Impact Summit. So you can join us next Thursday for a lunch session with SV at Home. We'll be talking about housing as a social determinant of health. Housing is good medicine. And then, as you can see, the rest of our sessions will be talking about empowering the communities that we pledge to serve. How does the California budget, nonprofits, how do the California budget, nonprofits, and equity go together? And then how do we seek equity in the time of what we're dealing with in terms of COVID-19? So go over to svcn.org to register for the rest of our sessions if you haven't already. And I want to just close this by letting you all know who our team is. If you haven't heard yet, we have combined forces with Cadre, Collaborating Agencies Disasters Relief Effort. And you can see here our list of team members. So you've got our SVCN staff and how we can support all of you, as well as our Cadre team. And Wendy, if you don't mind sharing in the chat our link to join our newsletter and to join as a member of SVCN. And then just one last reminder that as soon as I close this out, you will be directed to the Survey Monkey, where you can provide us feedback about today's session and let us know what you want to hear from SVCN in the future. So on that note, again, I want to thank Dale for being with us today. I know that you are a very busy person. I want to thank all of you for being with us as well as participants. And I want to thank my team for all of the work that you've done. Have a good afternoon, and I hope you enjoyed having lunch with us.
Thank you so much.